You died, and someone needed to do something about that. This is not a comfortable subject to sit with, but it's a necessary one, because for the vast majority of human history, death was not something that happened in a hospital where professionals would handle all the awkward details. Death was something that happened in your home, in your village, sometimes right in front of you, and then your community had to figure out what came next. So, what did they actually do? The answer changes depending on when and where you're asking the question, and some of the solutions ancient humans came up with were so effective that we're still using variations of them today. Let's start with the most basic fact. Dead bodies decompose. This is not a subtle process. If you leave a human corpse exposed to the elements, it will bloat within hours. Within days, it becomes a source of serious disease. The smell alone would alert predators from miles away. So ancient humans didn't have the luxury of not thinking about this problem. They had to solve it quickly, and they had to solve it in a way that their community could handle emotionally and practically. The earliest evidence we have suggests that ancient humans buried their dead. We're talking about 100,000 years ago, possibly longer. In a cave in Iraq called Shanidar, archaeologists found the skeleton of a Neanderthal that appeared to have been deliberately buried. The body was positioned carefully. There were flowers arranged around it. This suggests that even our ancient cousins understood that death meant something. It wasn't just disposal, it was ritual. But burial wasn't universal, and it wasn't always the first choice. In many parts of the world, ancient humans practiced something called excarnation, which is a fancy term for leaving the dead body exposed until the flesh decomposed and the bones could be collected. This happened in China, in parts of North America, and in various locations across Asia. The reasons made sense. In rocky terrain where digging graves was nearly impossible, excarnation solved a practical problem. You put the body on a platform or in a tree, let nature do the work, and weeks later you could gather the bones for secondary burial or cremation. And cremation, this is interesting because it shows up in multiple ancient cultures independently, which suggests it was solving a real problem that humans kept running into. When you burn a body, you're solving several problems at once. You're eliminating the smell, you're preventing disease, you're making the remains manageable enough to store or scatter. In ancient India, cremation was already established thousands of years ago. In ancient Greece, cremation became popular during certain periods. In ancient Rome, cremation was the standard practice for centuries before burial came back into fashion. But here's what's remarkable. In different cultures, they came to different conclusions about what death actually meant. For some, the body was just a container that no longer mattered once the person inside it was gone. For others, the body itself was sacred. You couldn't just leave it to rot because that would disrespect the person who used to inhabit it. In Egypt, this belief became so elaborate that they developed mummification, a process so sophisticated that some mummies have survived intact for 3,000 years. The ancient Egyptians didn't see the body as disposable. They saw it as a vessel that the person would need in the afterlife. Different cultures also had different ideas about what happened to the remains after the initial disposal. Some cultures practiced secondary burial. The body would decompose in one location and then the bones would be moved somewhere else. In New Guinea, some ancient peoples engaged in mortuary cannibalism, which sounds shocking until you understand the context. Eating a deceased relative wasn't about hunger or disrespect. It was a way of honoring them, of keeping them part of the community even after death. It was a form of reverence that modern people find disturbing, but it made sense within that culture's understanding of death and kinship. Other cultures created communal burial sites. Dolmens, which are large stone structures built over burial chambers, appear in Europe and Asia. They suggest that entire communities came together for burial rituals. The effort required to build them was enormous. You're talking about moving massive stones into specific configurations. Why would people do this unless death and burial were deeply important to their culture? The answer is obvious. They were. Death was treated as a major event that required collective action. In some ancient cultures, the location of burial mattered as much as the method. Burial grounds were placed at specific sites, sometimes on hilltops, sometimes in caves, sometimes in the center of settlements. The ancestral Puebloans in the American Southwest built cliff dwellings partly to live in them and partly to be near the burial sites of their ancestors. This suggests a belief system in which the dead didn't really leave. They stayed with their people, watching over them, requiring respect and ritual. And the rituals, every culture had specific rituals surrounding death. In ancient China, the body was washed and dressed in specific garments. Food was left with the dead. In some Viking cultures, the body was placed in a ship and set on fire, a ritual that probably served practical purposes, but also expressed something spiritual about the journey the dead were taking. In some African cultures, elaborate ceremonies would last for weeks or months, with singing and dancing and feasting. These weren't just ways to dispose of bodies, they were ways to process grief, to acknowledge the importance of the person who died, and to reinforce the bonds within the community. But not all ancient societies treated all dead people the same way. In many cultures, social status determined how you were buried. A wealthy person might get an elaborate tomb with grave goods placed inside. A poor person might get a simple hole in the ground with nothing. In some cultures, criminals or people who died shameful deaths were treated differently from respected community members. In ancient Rome, executed criminals might be thrown into a mass pit. In some cultures, people who died of certain diseases were isolated, their bodies treated separately because the community feared contamination. And here's something that changes how you think about ancient human behavior. Some cultures left evidence of grief markers. In ancient Israel, burials included tombstones and inscribed markers. In ancient Rome, tombstones often contained epitaphs expressing love or mourning. In some ancient cultures, people were buried with their most valued possessions, suggesting a belief that they would need them in the afterlife, or simply that those objects deserved to be with the person they valued most. The practices also changed over time within the same culture. In ancient Rome, cremation was dominant for centuries, then burial became more popular. In early Christian cultures, burial replaced cremation specifically because Christian theology emphasized the resurrection of the physical body, which meant cremation was seen as problematic. In medieval Europe, the church gained power over burial practices, and suddenly where and how you were buried became a matter of religious law, not just family preference. What all of this tells us is that ancient humans treated death as a major issue that required thought, ritual, and community participation. They didn't view the body as meaningless garbage to be thrown away. Even the most basic burial suggests respect. Even excarnation required effort and planning. The fact that cremation developed independently in multiple cultures suggests that it was seen as an elegant solution to a difficult problem, and the fact that different cultures came to different conclusions about the right way to handle death suggests that they were thinking deeply about what death meant, what the body meant, and what they owed to the people who had died. The modern world has inherited all of these practices. Cremation remains popular in some countries and religions. Burial remains standard in others. Some people are mummified, though not the way ancient Egyptians did it. Some people are left to natural decomposition in designated forests. Some are placed in mausoleums or crypts. The core impulse that drove ancient humans to carefully dispose of their dead and mark their graves and create rituals around death, that impulse hasn't changed. We still can't simply throw bodies away. We still feel like death requires ceremony. We still want to honor the people we've lost. So when you wonder what ancient humans did with dead bodies, the real answer isn't just about the practical methods, though those are interesting. The real answer is that they did what humans still do. They treated death as something that mattered. They did it with intention, and they did it together.